Morning, everybody. I hope you're all doing well, that you are staying at home, that you're staying safe, that you're caring for one another, connecting with each other, praying for each other, that you've been out enjoying the sun as you can in your 2 kilometers or in your garden or whatever it might be. If you've been back to school or your kids have been back to school, I hope that week's gone well as well. So today, I want to share with you something from one of my favorite books in the Bible. We're kind of in this in-between bit between Easter and starting a new series, and I was supposed to be preaching this in front of you all today, but we're still in lockdown, obviously, and so here we are. So I want to take us on a whistle-stop tour of one of my favorite books in the Bible. It's the Book of Ruth. It's a very short book. It's only 4 chapters, and it's kind of just telling a story. It's a story that doesn't seem to have much to do with the bigger story of the Bible on the surface, at least, until the last few verses. But I think it's a brilliant book with lots we can learn from it. And because it's a short story, it's also one of the easiest books to read. So before we take a look at some of the things we can learn from this about God and faith and life, from the story and from the characters, I want to invite you to pause me and give it a read. It should only take 10-15 minutes, and it will help you get a better idea of the whole story, and it will mean things make a bit more sense. So hopefully you've done that. Hopefully you've read it. But I'm going to take us through the story bit by bit and see what we can learn from it. So the story is set, we're told in verse 1, when the judges ruled Israel. Now, Judges is the book just before Ruth, and the way our Bibles are laid out, and it tells stories of how God raised up various men and women to lead and rescue Israel at various points and from various enemies. But it also shows how much Israel went away from their true calling as to be God's people. And most of the enemies they needed saving from, God seems to allow them to be conquered or defeat them because they've turned away from God over and over again. And so this story starts in Bethlehem and focuses on a family, Elimelech, his wife, Naomi, and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And they live in Bethlehem during a time when we hear there's a famine. And Elimelech makes what was probably quite a tough decision to move to neighboring Moab, where they've obviously heard things must be better. Moab wasn't well thought of in Israel, and it's not hard to imagine the rest of the town's residents not really approving this decision. We don't know how they reacted or what other people were doing to survive at this time, but what we do know is that the trip doesn't go well for this family. First, Elimelech dies, and then the 2 sons, they marry local women, but then they die as well. So Naomi, the wife and the mother's life is thrown upside down and torn apart. She's left with nothing, and she's not particularly shy about saying as much. She decides to return home, and her daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah, go with her to begin with. There seems to be a huge amount of loyalty and love and care for Naomi from these two, but in her grieving and bitter emotional state, Naomi can't see their commitment and love through the pain that she's feeling, and she tells them, go back to your homes, that your life will be better there. Orpah decides to go, but Ruth refuses to leave, and in verses 16 and 17 of chapter 1, we see just how committed she is to Naomi, claiming that not even death will let her be separated from Naomi. And it's clear that Ruth is buying into more than just this relationship with Naomi. She's actually seems to have given her life and her allegiance to God, to Israel's God, and to the people of Israel. So here's a woman and a foreigner, no less, showing loyalty and commitment not just to her family, but to God as well, in a time where Israel are constantly being reminded of their disloyalty by God, seemingly abandoning them to one group after another. And we have Naomi, who believes that not only God has abandoned her, but that has actually afflicted her and brought misfortune upon her. And so chapter 1 finishes up with a statement of how they arrive back. People look and wonder, is this Naomi that's returned? And you can imagine that they were thinking, what's gone wrong, that it's her and some woman. So they return to Bethlehem at the beginning of the harvest. And so Naomi had heard things had gone better, and they've gone back home. And their timely arrival is one of several seeming coincidences, which is going to turn this whole mess around. So they've arrived at the beginning of the harvest. So we move on, and Ruth again shows more positive action, deciding that she's going to go and find food from nearby fields. It's kind of not hard to imagine Naomi's response in verse 2 as being said with a sigh, barely acknowledging Ruth as she continues to kind of feel hard done by and abandoned by God. Life as a widow, a woman, and a foreigner wasn't easy in ancient cultures, but God had decided that Israel was going to be different and it was going to take care of the needy. And what Ruth does, which is called gleaning, is one outworking of what this looked like. When the workers go around the fields and collect the harvest, if any grain was to fall, they were to leave it for others to come and collect. They also had to leave the corners of their fields for the same reason. So Ruth goes to a field, and coincidence number two, she ends up in the field of a man called Boaz, who just happens to be a close relative of Naomi. Now, we don't know a lot of personal details about Boaz in the story, but what is clear is that he's following these rules. And in the case of Ruth, he actually goes above and beyond them. He eats with her, tells his workers to look out for her, and tells her to come back to his field, not to go to others. Being alone in a field wouldn't have been a safe place for a young woman like Ruth, and Boaz has heard about what she's done for Naomi, and her loyalty has been rewarded. Ruth goes home with enough grain for both her and Naomi and more to spare. And she fills Naomi in on all the strange but pretty amazing things that have happened that day. And Naomi's mood seems to be shifting and improving. And this is a positive turn of events at last. We then move forward, and Naomi has obviously been hatching a plan. We don't know how long has passed, but she wants to marry Ruth off. And she thinks Boaz is the closest relative, and he seems like a good man of standing. Naomi wants Ruth's life to be good. She wants somewhere that she's going to be provided for. She tells Ruth to go and get dressed up and to go down to a Boaz and effectively to ask him to marry her. Boaz, as you can imagine, is pretty surprised by this, but it seems pleasantly so. He agrees, but there is a catch. Like in any classic romantic comedy, Naomi actually has a closer relative, and his first refusal on buying the land, and in turn redeeming Ruth and the family. The next day, Boaz meets this relative and offers him the chance to redeem the land. And at first he seems to agree, but Boaz reminds him that that means marrying Ruth as well, which he says he cannot do. He passes over the rights to Boaz, who marries Ruth, and they have a son together. Naomi, who had renamed herself Mara, which means bitter, gains a son. Her life, which had been full of grief and loss, has come full circle. She now has a family again. And not only a family, but as we see in those final few verses of chapter 4, this son is called Obed, and he would become the grandfather of some guy called David. David of Goliath fame and the greatest king that Israel would ever have, at least until his descendant Jesus comes along. I think it's a great story, one that I think Hollywood could do a pretty good modernized version of. But what's the point in it? It kind of seems like this strange, weird little story to have in the Bible. And it only seems important because Ruth is related to David, but surely it can't just be about that. And there's a chance that that's part of the reason the story's in the Bible, but it's unlikely that's the main one. The ending seems to kind of be stating facts more than being the whole point of the story. And it's also a strange story in that God is mentioned regularly, but never by the narrator. God is only really talked about by the characters and doesn't seem to directly influence the events at all. In fact, most of the mentions of God are from Naomi, and she's not even talking to God. She's kind of just moaning about him. But I think this is one of the major lessons we can actually learn from the book. Because although it doesn't seem like God is present, and Naomi certainly doesn't think so, God is clearly there and working through events, even terrible ones like the death of her husband and sons. God's in control, and although he does sometimes work in incredible, miraculous ways, most of us day to day don't experience that. We might even wonder whether God has a plan in mind, or whether we've gone down a wrong path, made a bad decision, and it's almost game over. But that's not how God works. His will for us isn't like some maze where we need to find the right turns. God sees it all and he works through it all. It's usually only with time, reflection, and hindsight that we can see how God is working. I'm younger than quite a lot of you that might be listening, but I can look back and see how God has worked through things in my life in ways that I couldn't have imagined. I didn't want to move to Ireland when my family moved to Ireland. I didn't get my first choice university course. I wanted to do a PhD and I didn't get the funding for that. And there's been loads of more things in between. But God seems to have worked through all of those things for not just my good, but I think for his kingdom as well. If I'd got the PhD funding, then it's unlikely I'd be working in Dublin West Community Church, for instance. And if I'd got my first choice course on the CAO, I may never have got involved with youth work in the first place. And that, among many other things, would mean I never met Ola. Naomi had experienced even more significant life events than those, and she rightly felt abandoned by God, but God hadn't abandoned her and would restore her in a way that she would never have imagined. And that doesn't take away the difficulties or the pain. It doesn't rose tint them, but it does mean that we can trust in God's providence, that He is working. And just like in Ruth, it's often through coincidences that we can see that work out. They just happened to return at the barley harvest. Ruth happened to end up in Boaz's field, and the closer relative just happened to not be able to fulfill his right and duty. Ruth also reminds me of another of my favorite books in the Bible, the Book of Esther. God isn't mentioned at all in that book, but again, coincidences or chance happenings occur over and over, which lead to Esther's success and to the saving of the Jewish people. I think these two, together with other stories, show us the other side of life to the more famous, perhaps, Moses's and Elijah's. Sometimes we pray and God will work through the miraculous, pouring out fire from heaven, healing people, bringing about circumstances which we'd hoped and asked for. But other times, and I think most of the time, God works in more subtle and silent ways. And I think that Ruth shows us that in those moments and times we need to not only trust in God, but also to be patient and wait. We aren't given a timeline of events in Ruth, but at the end of chapter 2 and 3, it seems like there's a period where they just wait. They keep calm and carry on. Ruth continues to glean in the field until the time comes that Naomi suggests approaching Boaz. And after she approaches him, they wait to see what will happen. And thankfully, he goes about it that same day. Sometimes I've kind of felt like praying is a whole lot of waiting, and waiting in silence a lot of the time too. And that's not just for the minute or the 10 minutes or however long I might be sitting for, but sometimes for days, weeks, months. Right now, we're going through a time where more than ever, we're all probably praying with our hearts as one for our world, for the people who are ill, for those who've lost loved ones, and those looking after them. And why isn't God doing something about it? Why isn't He fixing it? And the Bible doesn't really give an answer for those sort of things. John Lennox, who's a famous scientist and Christian apologist, he's written a book on the coronavirus, which I haven't read yet, but I saw this quote from it, and he says, "A Christian is not so much a person who has solved the problem of pain, suffering, and the coronavirus, but one who has come to love and trust a God who has himself suffered." That's what being a Christian in pain and suffering comes down to. It comes down to trusting and loving and continuing to follow the God who, as we just celebrated Easter, suffered and went through unimaginable pain for you and for me. And I don't think we have to be necessarily happy about that. Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he clearly wanted there to be another way. But his response, "Not my will, but yours, Father," it needs to be our anthem through this time and every other time in our lives. We have to trust God. Naomi at points clearly didn't. She'd given up on God to some extent. And it's almost sad that in all her bitterness and grieving, she doesn't ever seem to take it to God. She just kind of says it about him. But God can handle it. He can handle my anger. He can handle our confusion and our grief. He's been there. He knows what it's like to lose a loved one, to grieve. And we can take our prayers to him and wait, trusting in him through it all. And in this strange time where the especially vulnerable people in our society are suffering the most, I think this story also highlights something that we all know, but maybe sometimes we don't live out. And that's that God cares. God cares for the widow. He cares for the orphan. He cares for the sick. He cares for the elderly people, those with health conditions. He cares for those that are suffering, cocooning, and lonely. And as a church, we need to as well. We've been looking at the idea of what it means to be a church in this strange time where we can't meet together, where we can't see each other, where we can't hold each other, where we can't hug, where we can't shake hands, and how we need to stay connected, we need to stay caring, and we need to keep praying. And that's kind of a good analogy for the story of Ruth, because she stays connected to Naomi and her family and to God, as she cared for Naomi and was then cared for by Boaz. And she and Naomi, in different ways, they hoped for an end to their sufferings and confusion. We need to be people that care for the vulnerable, especially now, but always in any way that we can. Jesus tells his disciples to literally go the extra mile, and that was to help their enemies, let alone people they actually liked. So let's be people in Dublin West and around Dublin that pray, that trust in God through this time and throughout the ups and downs of life. People who keep praying, but also wait patiently and trust that God knows best. and that he knows our pain, that he cares for those suffering more than we ever could. It's much easier said than done, but we can look at a story like Ruth and see that even from the worst of circumstances, God can redeem and restore us. And since the first Easter, that's what's happening to the whole world. We're asked to play our part, whatever that may be, just like Ruth did.